In this video, we'll discuss sin with respect to object, end, and circumstance, according to St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologiae Prima Secundae, question 7, and questions 18 through 21. The circumstances of a human action are the qualities or characteristics of the action that we have to look through when deciding if the action is good, sinful, or neutral. These characteristics are called circumstances, from the Latin for standing around, because they are, in a way, those things that surround or measure an action. These circumstances are usually listed as location, in other words, where did the action happen? For instance, in a church, at school, or in a private house. The time of the action, for instance, when did it happen? On a holiday, on Sunday, during class? The quality of an action, or in other words, what was the mode of acting? Were you hitting someone hard or hitting them lightly? Were you correcting your boss impudently or politely? What were the consequences of the action? What was the end or final cause? That is, why was the action done in the first place? For instance, were you giving money to benefit others or just to show off? 6. What's the material cause of the action? About what was the action done? For instance, a great deal of money was given or only a small amount of money was given. That could make a difference in the moral character of the action. 7th, we could look at the agent of the action. Who was the one doing it? Now, the police taking someone into custody is one thing, but a private person doing so is another thing. That could be kidnapping. So the agent of the action also matters. The 8th circumstance we could consider is the instruments. What did he or she use in doing the action? For instance, writing the correct answer on a test without an external help is one thing, but writing the right answer on the test by secretly using a calculator or your neighbor's test is another thing. Your neighbor's test or the calculator would be an instrument that is something that has to be considered in the moral evaluation of your action. Every action coming from a human will have an almost infinite number of characteristics or circumstances. If I blink, then that action can be described as blinking on a Friday, or as a philosophy teacher blinking, or as blinking while sitting to the right of a door, or as blinking instead of keeping my eyes open while sitting at 5 p.m. on a Friday. Such enumerations of circumstances are useless for the study of ethics. In ethics, we are only interested in circumstances of an action under two conditions. 1. Is the action a human action, as opposed to a merely involuntary act of a human? 2. Are the circumstances relevant to the rule of reason? That is, are they related to the natural, divine, human, or eternal law? Here are some examples. Since me blinking at my computer was involuntary, this is not a human action. Moreover, the circumstances of me being at my computer while doing this action is totally irrelevant to the moral law. If I choose to blink while at my computer, then my blinking is a voluntary action, but still the circumstance of me being at my computer is irrelevant to the moral law. On the other hand, if I choose to blink a long time while driving, then we have an action that is both voluntary, because I chose it, and where the combination of circumstances, namely for a long time and while driving, are deeply relevant to the moral law, since I'm endangering people's lives. In the last case, my action is a sin falling under the vice of recklessness, which is opposed to the virtue of courage. The essence of this sin is blinking for a long time while driving. In another video, we saw that human actions can be related to virtue in one of 7 ways. Either they are the proper act of virtue itself, they are an act necessary for the proper act of virtue, they are an act that improves the proper act of virtue without being strictly necessary, they are acts unrelated to the virtue, they are acts that diminish but don't entirely impede the proper act of virtue, they are acts that are likely to result in not being able to do the proper act of virtue, or they are acts that are incompatible with the proper act of virtue. The different ways result from the various circumstances of an action. For instance, watching a football game is the act of sitting with one's eyes open while in a stadium in which football is being played, or something like that. Now, as we said before, since the principle of human action is the common good, and since a mortal sin is a sin concerning the principle of human action, it follows that human actions are sinful if they include circumstances making the action contrary to a virtue governing our will's relation to the common good. The virtues that govern our will's relation to the common good, as we saw before, are general justice and charity. So human actions are mortally sinful if they include circumstances that make them contrary to general justice or charity. If a sin is contrary to a lower virtue, such as temperance, it may still be a mortal sin if the sin is also against justice or charity. For instance, adultery is not only a sin against temperance in most cases, but also a sin against justice and charity. So adultery is mortally sinful. Similarly, if a general acts cowardly in battle, this is not only a sin against fortitude, but it is also contrary to the security of the state, and so it is a sin against justice. So the general's act of cowardice is a mortally sinful act. Nevertheless, if a sin against a lower virtue is still compatible with the proper ordering demanded by general justice and charity, then that sin is not a mortal sin, but a venial one. For instance, suppose someone eats too much, far beyond what is required to maintain their own bodily health. But this person does not eat so much that this excessive eating impedes his ability to fulfill his own obligation to society. In this case, the person commits the sin of gluttony, which is contrary to the virtue of temperance. But his gluttony is not a mortal sin, only a venial sin. Gluttony here is still a venial sin because it either isn't related to the ultimate end or diminishes the proper act of general justice or charity, which are more perfectly performed by one who is healthy and not attached to the unneeded pleasures of food. Let us summarize what we've concluded here and in a previous video. Mortal sins are like wounds or illnesses in the very heart of the moral life. They are fatal, but venial sins are like wounds or illnesses that touch only the appendages of the moral life, the exterior. They are not fatal to the moral life, but only damage it. Mortal sins are human actions contrary to the virtues of general justice and charity. This contrariety occurs when the circumstances of an action relate to the virtue so as to impede its proper activity or something needed for its proper activity. Venial sins are human actions that are either unrelated to the proper action of general justice or charity, or which diminish those proper actions or what is needed for them. Sins that are against the lower virtues, temperance, fortitude, may be mortal or venial. If they are only against the lower virtue, then in itself the sin is venial. But if they are against the lower virtue inasmuch as it is ordered towards the ends of general justice and charity, as, for instance, adultery is against both temperance as well as justice, then these sins are mortally sinful. When circumstances don't bring about any relation to the moral law, then they are morally irrelevant. If I drive recklessly on a Tuesday, the circumstance on a Tuesday doesn't affect the moral nature of my action for better or for worse. Likewise, if a nun gives food to a blonde homeless person or to a brunette homeless person, the circumstances blonde and brunette are totally morally irrelevant. Now, there are three ways that circumstances can relate to an action in a morally relevant way. The first way is to give the human action its moral species or essence. For instance, theft is a species of sin in which the agent takes what belongs to another. The circumstance belonging to another is not accidental to theft, but is part of the very essence or definition of theft. It is part of what makes theft the specific kind of human act that it is. Likewise, murder is a species of sin in which the agent kills someone who is innocent. The circumstance who is innocent is not accidental to murder, but is part of the very definition or essence of murder. Another way in which circumstances can relate to an action in a morally relevant way are to give the action an additional moral species or an additional essence. Now, normally, something can't have two essences, but in the case of human actions, they can be two different species of human action. The very same action can have two different species or essences. Here, let's see how this works. For instance, if you steal from a church, then this is not only an act of theft, but in virtue of the circumstance from a church, it is also the sin of sacrilege. So the very same physical action is actually two human actions, both the act of theft and the act of sacrilege. Likewise, if you steal from a family that is starving, the theft is not only theft, but may also be an act of murder. A third way in which circumstances can relate to an action in a morally relevant way are to increase the moral goodness or badness of the human action without changing its species. For instance, if you steal $1,000 from the bank and your friend steals $10,000, you have both committed the same human action, namely theft, but your friend's sin is worse. That's because he stole more. Likewise, if a friend of yours is grieving after having lost a sibling, you may call him on the phone to comfort him, or you may go to visit with him in person. In both cases, you are doing the same moral act, but in the latter case, you've done it in an even more praiseworthy way. So sometimes circumstances give the act its species, sometimes they give it a second species, so that the act has two essences. And sometimes the circumstances don't give the act a species, but they make it better or worse within the same species. Now, circumstances in an act which are morally irrelevant are totally outside the human action and can be ignored. Circumstances that give the action its essence or species are called the object or end of the action. The object of an action is the proximate end intended by the agent. When, however, we talk about the end or goal of an action, we usually are not talking about the object, that is the proximate end, but some further end intended by means of the object. For instance, if someone tells a lie in order to steal, then in one external act, they have committed two human actions, lying and theft. Since these human acts are related to each other as means and end, we say that lying is the object, what is proximately intended, and that theft is the end, that is, what is remotely intended. Notice here that both the object and the end are technically ends, but we use the word object for the proximate end and end for the remote end, that is, what is further desired. When one physical action constitutes two human actions, not ordered to one another, for instance, theft and sacrilege, both human actions are called objects. They are both what is proximately intended. Circumstances that increase or diminish the moral goodness or badness of an action are called accidents or circumstances of an action. Although we can call the things constituting the essence of an action circumstances as well, it is more proper to restrict the name circumstance to only those things that are outside the species of a human action. So technically, the object can be called a circumstance, but it's more proper to use the word circumstance only for those things which are outside the essence of that action.